The classic account of this, the American account for most of our history, is that's because we're the same kind of thing.
Mhm.
We're equal. And in what way are we equal? We're equal in our natures. And the troubled part comes this way. If our natures include how we come to be, then the differences between the sexes are also part of our rights, and also, therefore, our obligations. And that's what you're telling me this morning about a law that's proceeding in Ireland. And they're going to make it illegal to possess books that claim that sex is an innate feature or that you don't get to choose your own. Is that what it is?
That's part of it. Yeah. Well, it depends on how they define. Depends on how they end up defining hate speech, but that's already built into the law. That the idea that making a distinction between men and women that's categorical, that's already part of hate speech. Yeah. Well, and it is in part a outspring. This is again where you see the weakness in Nietzsche's argument. Well, here's the values we've created. Well, that's not a very good replacement for God. Our replacement for God is narcissistic radicals get to do whatever the hell they want, whenever they want, all the time. And if you oppose it, then it's prison for you. Well, that's not much of a substitute for what we had before. So, and that was I went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Rome, and that was the first established church. And it became the model for European society. So it's so interesting the way these conceptions are laid out, let's say architecturally, rather than conceptually. So at the very center, you have the crucifix, the cross. And that's what would you say? That's the point where all of reality comes to a point. And it's the point of maximal suffering. And it's more than that. It's the point of voluntarily accepted maximal suffering. And the notion is that that's a sacrifice. Why is it a sacrifice? You have to sacrifice your lower self to your higher self in order for you to proceed in a healthy manner, to be resilient, but also for you to participate in the covenant that would make for a united society. You have to, and there's no difference between that and maturation, because a lot of what maturation is to give up the attractions of the immediate present in the service of something broader and higher. And that would be you in the broader sense and what's in your best interest, but also the community simultaneously. Those are the same thing. So at the center of the community, you have the sacrifice, the voluntary sacrifice of self. That's the center. Around that, you have the church, you have the altar, then you have the church, then you have the town. And around the town, you have the state, and then you have the nation. And that's all resting on this spirit of voluntary self-sacrifice, right? And that's the foundation stone of the community. Jung knew that. Jung knew that. And Freud didn't. And because Freud was a materialistic, deterministic atheist of the 19th century. And Jung is a 20th century thinker. Maybe he's a 21st century thinker even. That's certainly possible.
So Churchill said, wrote once in a book called My Early Life, you must nail your life to a cross of thought or action. Mm-hmm. Now, he ended up doing both. But in either case, whichever way you go, and so you could say in your life, Jordan Peterson, it was more thought in the beginning, and it might be more action now, but in either case, it's a cross. Hmm. That's how you think of it?
Well, you can either lift up a cross or have one dropped on you.
Yeah.
Right? There's no non-cross option in this world. And that's really worth knowing too. And I tell my audiences that consistently. It's like, you all know perfectly well that your idiot hedonism, your idiot immature hedonism is going to vanish in a puff of smoke at the first sign of trouble. You know that. And you know that it's thin gruel. That's why you're hedonistic and hopeless at the same time. You know that. You need something beyond that. Why? Because life in some ways is unbearable. And so you need something worth bearing to make it bearable. And life is very heavy load. And so that means you have to carry something very heavy to justify it. Now, I see this in the biblical corpus, for example. quite clearly laid out in the story of Abraham, which is a very interesting story. And of course, Abraham is the founder of nations. And so, and you might say, well, is that true? It's like, those are such stupid questions. That's such a stupid question. It's a definition in this story. So the definition is, the spirit of Abraham is the founder of nations, right? That's the declaration of the story. And you're to come to understand that when you read the story. Now, you might say, well, what did the people who wrote the story mean by that? And the answer is, well, they didn't know. And that's why they wrote the story. Like, the story is the explanation. Okay, so what's the story? Well, Abraham is a human being. And that means he's like a natural human being. And that means he's useless and lazy. And if he can have it easy, he will. And so Abraham is like the first case of white privilege. Here's a good joke. He's rich. His parents are rich. And he can just lay around his tent all day and eat peeled grapes and have like beautiful slave women wave palm fronds over him and do nothing. And he does that for like 83 years. And then one day a voice comes to him, right? A spirit. He's inspired by a spirit. And what's the nature of the spirit? Well, it's the spirit that calls him to adventure. And it says to him, get your lazy ass the hell out of the tent. You're made for more than this. And so Abraham, in a great act of faith, abides by the intuition of this spirit. And he leaves his comfortable infancy, right? Because he's an infant. He lives in an infantile utopia. It's right. Well, what do I want? Well, I never want to be hungry and I never want to be thirsty. I never want to be deprived. It's like, well, great. You're an infant sleeping in a crib. You've got infant paradise. Is that what you're made for, right? The mere cessation of your needs. That's your vision of utopia, is it? Well, that was Abraham's vision of utopia. And a counter spirit came along and said, get your lazy ass the hell out of your tent and get out there in the world. And of course, it's a complete catastrophe, right? Like, he faces tyranny and war and the necessary sacrifice of his son and collusion among the aristocrats to steal his wife. And like, it's just a disaster in 10 different directions. But it's an adventure. It's an adventure, right? And so what's life? Is it hedonistic, infantile bliss? This is something Dostoevsky objected to. Or is it a romantic adventure? Well, what do people go watch when they go see a movie? They watch a romantic adventure. Well, why? Because that's what they want in their life. They don't want peace and tranquility and guaranteed basic income and the pleasures of gratified infantile dependence. They want a bloody adventure. And if they don't get a real adventure, they'll take a false one and wreak havoc. And we have no shortage of false adventures in our culture.
So the woke culture and the transgender movement and all these great things that have come upon us so hard, are they going to suppress that for people? You're not going to get to have your adventure. You're going to have
they put forward a false adventure. And the false adventure is wave a placard and save the world. That's right. Look, great. Isn't that wonderful? All you have to do, you know how I stopped getting protesters to my events at university? I held them in the morning.
That's great.
No kidding, eh? I'm the Messiah. Yeah, really? Well, as long as you don't want me to get out of bed before noon. Yeah, so that's the false adventure sold to young kids. It's like, well, the planet's going to hell in a handbasket. That's the claim. It's like, yeah, the planet's always been going to hell in a handbasket, right? The apocalypse is always nigh. And that's because we die and so does everything else. And so, well, the apocalypse is nigh and you can save the world by protesting against those who are at fault. That's what the universities sell young people. Well, it's an adventure, right? They have a messianic urge at that age. And that really never goes away in people in some fundamental sense, but it's particularly acute when late adolescents are trying to catalyze their identity, and the left offers these false adventures. You can be you print out a sign that says, I oppose poverty, as if anyone doesn't, and you wave that around publicly, which is the same as praying in public, right? It's a great sin, and you proclaim your moral virtue, and bang, that's your adventure. And it's a cheap pathway to reputational accomplishment. And part of the reason young guys do it, you know perfectly well, is because they're trying to impress young women. And it's kind of what would you say? There's a surface attraction to being a kind of rebellious quasi-Che Guevara type and to be taking on, the evil corporations of the world when you're 18, instead of working at 7-Eleven and handing out sugar water to kids.
Do you think that there's something that young people really need that will ultimately redeem them from this? Enough of them, at least, to save the world? Do you think that
they need a burden?
They need a burden.
Absolutely.
And they want one, you're saying. You bet.
Absolutely. Well, and you can explain that to them in some ways the way I just explained it. It's like, look, guys, you're going to suffer. And most of them are already suffering, so they know that. It's like, and you want to suffer stupidly too? Because that's even worse. And then do you want to contemplate for a moment what's going to be your arc when the storms come? Well, I can tell you what it is. And you already know this because you've consulted your own conscience. When you're awake at 3 a.m. thinking about what a useless bastard you are, how many sins you have on your conscience, if you're fortunate, there'll be a few of your adventures come to mind where you think, well, I didn't do so bad then. Maybe there's something to me. And so what do people remember when they have those memories? They remember the times when they stepped outside of their narrow selves and took on some bloody responsibility, at least for themselves. And then maybe for someone else too. And then maybe for a lot of other people. And so if you tell young men, look, you're going to find the meaning in your life by adopting maximal responsibility, right? That's going to be extremely difficult because you're so bloody useless. You can't even get your own house in order. And you're going to be called upon not only to get your house in order, but to do that well enough so some woman can stand having you around for more than like 15 minutes in the back of a car. And then maybe you're going to have to do it so that you could be a good father to a family and a pillar of the community. And that's not just empty words. It's like, if you do that nobly, there'll be something to you. And then when the storms come, you won't be blown over by the first 4-foot wave. And young men think, I could be something that wasn't blown over by the first 4-foot wave? They think, oh, well, that's inspiring. Maybe that's worth doing a little work towards it on the off chance it might be true. And the thing about it is true. So it's not that difficult once you understand it to make a case for it. It's true. And it is also true that you grow in proportion to the weight you take on voluntarily. And it's also true that we have no idea what the upper limit to that is, right? So, you've met remarkable people in your life. People can do remarkable things. And there are inevitably people who took on remarkable burdens. And because they did that, their development was forced by necessity. They were forced by necessity to grow beyond what they were. And who knows what the limit to that is?
People, something I see in the college business, our college, Hillsdale College, has got about the same number of boys and girls, a few more boys. And they come from a pool of applicants that are equal size and equal qualification. Almost nobody has that.
Right.
And the boys do just about as well as the girls, although they do get into contests doing things like throwing deer urine on each other and stuff. They've done that. But some of the best boys I ever met have done that. As a matter of fact, they're in the Marine Corps now. Stupid boys. And the thing is, people will say, how are you successful with boys? And I say, we treat them like boys. They want to be treated like boys.
Mm-hmm.
And girls, women, we've always had boys and girls here, women and men here, right? And they've always done well. And their intellectual capacities are, they're the same kind of thing. And their physical paths are not the same. And they can wish them the same if they want to. But
they don't. Not really.
They don't. What I find is, I have 2 daughters. You have 1, I think. And your daughter is like my daughters. Very tough, very assertive, very womanly, you see. And so, in other words, the classic account is they're good at being what they are. And that's a service, human above all, but also male or female. And that's a service, that burden you're talking about. The first burden everyone carries is, how do you become a good one of these? And if by thinking it, that's all, as you say, that's no burden. So no satisfaction. How do you think, predict the future for me a little bit? What's going to happen? Seems to me things are coming to a point. Do you think so?
Yeah, well, I think things have always been coming to a point, but they're coming to a point way faster. And I mean, that's partly a consequence of the technological revolution. I mean, we know that, well, we have Moore's law, right? Computing power doubles every 18 months. It's like, no, you don't understand. Computing power doubles every 18 months. That's not some casual phrase. That's an absolute bloody revolution in every possible direction. And it's not just computing power, it's storage power. And there's all sorts of doublings taking place. And we're now at the point in the course of technological progress where those doublings are happening multiple times within the span of a single life. And so it's pretty obvious. And that means the ancient archetypal battles are accelerating. That's exactly what it means. The battles between good and evil is accelerating. And it's always been there. Is the apocalypse nigh? It's like, well, it's always been nigh, but it might be a little more nigh than it has been in the past. And
you've been talking about artificial intelligence, and recently I have become more concerned about that. What are your concerns and what are your hopes for it?
Well, I suppose my fundamental concern is that we'll automate a super intelligent tyranny. Right. And I mean, that's not a concern that's limited to me. That's the motif of endless numbers of science fiction dystopias. And, science fiction is where engineers dream.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And sometimes it's where they have their nightmares. And engineers are notoriously atheistic. And so they turn to worship of Star Wars, for example, as an alternative. But their nightmares and dreams are in the popular culture, in popular imagination. And dystopian science fiction is the nightmare of engineers. And the nightmare of Tower of Babel building engineers is that we'll automate a super intelligent tyranny. The Chinese are hell-bent on doing that. They're doing it at the moment. Could we do it here? Absolutely. Are we? Yeah. Will that dominate? We'll see. My sense, and I learned a fair bit of this from Jung, by the way. One of the things I learned from Jung was that salvation, redemption, was an individual enterprise, which is why I'm a psychologist and not a politician, because I believe that to be true. I think that hell is, what would you say, kept at bay one person at a time. And I do believe that people have a divine destiny, let's say, and one of the proper elements of our divine destiny is to keep hell at bay. And you do that as a consequence of your choices as an individual. I also believe that every single individual is in that up to their necks. Dostoevsky said something very strange at one point. He said, every man is responsible not only for everything he does, but for everyone else does. And of course, that's insane, right? In that crazy Dostoevsky way that is more sane, that insanity that's more sane than sanity. That's Dostoevsky in a nutshell. And I think there's something true about it, is that we each have an archetypal destiny, and the fate of the world rests on each person's shoulders, like genuinely. And when I'm traveling around the world, talking to people, I'm trying to tell them that. It's like, no, you don't understand. This is up to you. Now, I don't understand how it can be up to you because it's also up to me. And I don't exactly see how it can be equally and finally up to both of us, but that's okay. There's lots of things about the world I don't understand. And I suppose being, what would you say, touched by a spark of divinity, which is, I suppose, what characterizes us, each of us bears an infinite responsibility. And people need to know that, and that this is no game.
So you have to carry the burden for more than your own sake.
Well, your sake is indistinguishable from the sake of the totality. See, the Buddha figured this out, right? Because Buddha what would you say? He achieved enlightenment under the Bo tree. He was in nirvana. He was in paradise, and he could stay there. That was on the table, and that's a hell of an offer to be able to stay in paradise. And he rejected it. And the reason he rejected it was because it was, in his estimation, any paradise that it didn't include everyone wasn't the real paradise. And so he left nirvana to come back to earth, so to speak, to serve as a teacher, to drag everyone else along on the road to nirvana. And that's correct. Is that it's correct in that in the final analysis, there is no distinction between you and someone else. It's a terrible thing to contemplate. They're the same thing. And that's why you're supposed to love your enemy, I suppose. And what does that mean, to love your enemy? Well, first of all, it might mean, to begin with, to hope that he wouldn't have to be an enemy, because why not have a friend? But it's even more than that, is that to the degree that it's possible, your actions, even in the presence of your enemy, should be devoted towards the redemption of your enemy. That would be better for you and for them.
I mean, if you're good and your enemy is not good, you'd be right to oppose him for the sake of the good and those who represent it. But
well, you redeem what you can redeem and you reject the rest, right? And that's the separation of the wheat from the chaff.
That's it.
Well, I learned something a while back about, there's this idea at the end of Genesis, when God throws Adam and Eve out of paradise, he sets these cherubs up to guard the gates of paradise, and they're monstrous forms, these cherubs, and they hold swords that are on fire that turn every which way. It's a very horrifying image. And what does it mean? It means that, well, a sword cuts and cleaves and butchers and kills, but a sword can be used to carve. So you can think about a sword as an implement that separates the wheat from the chaff. And a burning sword, well, that's even worse, right? Because it burns the dead wood away. And so a flaming sword is a sword that cuts all that isn't necessary away and burns all the dead wood off. And of course that's the case, because everything unworthy has to be cut away in order for it to enter paradise, by definition, and all dead wood has to be burned away before the living essence can enter paradise. That's another way of thinking about it. And if you're 99% dead wood and pathology, it isn't obvious that the encounter with the flaming sword that turns every which way won't just do you in. And that's the issue of evil in some regard. You want to redeem what can be redeemed, but you need to reject what's truly serpentine. And that's Eve's sin, by the way. She doesn't do that. She hearkens to the serpent itself. And that's a narcissism of compassion. That's her sin. It's a pride of compassion. My womanly embrace is such that all things can be clasped by breast, including the poisonous serpent. It's like, well, yeah, maybe not including the poisonous serpent, right? And I see that playing out in the world now, because we have this epidemic of narcissistic compassion where everything can be invited to the table. It's like, well, maybe not everything. Right. And maybe there's only a small remnant of what is truly hellish that has to be rejected, that there's no hope of redeeming. I mean, this is an ancient theological issue, right? But this was played out quite recently in the case of Nicola Sturgeon, right? Because Sturgeon, in the Scottish Prime Minister, she famously proclaimed that, well, any man who says he's a woman is a woman. It's like, I'm so compassionate. It's like, people can do whatever they want. It's like, any man, eh? How about psychopathic, serial killing, sadistic rapists? How about them? Well, when she was asked that question, which she was, she had to hand wave, partly because for someone like her, no one like that exists. Not really. But the problem is that people like that do exist, or spirits like that exist.